just forgot that I was supposed to record this. So now this is being recorded, and we'll have this to share it on our website at a later date. So I want to get started here and just kind of give a little bit of background. In 2014, sorry, a couple of people are joining here and I have to have some mute. In 2014, the Blue Ribbon Panel on Sustaining America's Diverse Fish and Wildlife Resources was convened to evaluate and understand the current conservation funding shortfall and also to seek out solutions. And from this Alliance for America's Fish and the Alliance for America's Fish and Wildlife was formed. And the Alliance has a wide, diverse membership, including the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, who joined in 2019. And the Blue Ribbon Panel identified America's wildlife that were at risk. So this kind of shows us an overview that they identified 1/3 of species, 1/3 of species are at risk of extinction, and also 12,000 species of greatest conservation need, and about 1,600 species listed on the Endangered Species Act. They also looked at current conservation funding and tried to find the gaps, and they identified in state funding that there was a gap of about $1.3 billion per year. And in comparison, we can look at the how tribal fish and wildlife programs are funded. And many of you know this funding is and has been one of the #1 issues in tribal fish and wildlife management, mainly the lack of. And we know that tribes are excluded from the Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson excise taxes. And tribes have tried numerous times to amend these acts, and those efforts have been unsuccessful for the most part. We also have the Public Law 93-638 contracts, which provide base funding for many tribes, but it's inadequate and hasn't had a substantial increase ever, really. So a contract that's entered into in the 1980s has roughly the same amount of funding in 2020. One of the successes of tribes and states' attempts at increasing funding for fish and wildlife was the creation of the Tribal Wildlife Grants, or TWIG. However, these are grants and they usually fund projects instead of real capacity building infrastructure. Tribes also rely on hunting and fishing license revenue to fund their programs. However, this varies greatly based on resources, accessibility, marketing, and also the tribe's views on management. Tribes also supplement their programs with other tribal funds such as land lease, casino revenue, and again, that just varies by tribe. So many of the panelists that you'll hear from are part of a tribal coalition for the recovery, and that was instrumental in making sure that there's a tribal title in recovery. And the tribal title provides $97.5 million of funding for tribal fish and wildlife programs. It's dedicated funding for wildlife conservation. It's permanent funding, not subject to annual appropriations. The funding will come from the general U.S. Treasury Fund, and it's still authorized and directed to the Wildlife Conservation Restoration Program account. So just some background. Tribal conservation and impact for recovery. Tribes own and influence the management of a natural resource base of nearly 140 million acres. And that includes more than 730,000 acres of lakes and reserves, over 10,000 miles of streams and rivers, and over 18 million acres of forested lands. And also tribal lands provide vital habitat for more than 525 federally listed threatened and endangered plants and species. So what will recovering do to help tribes? Well, it would help tribes to manage wildlife and habitat on our own lands, as well as collaboration across jurisdictions, such as with states, private landowners, etc., to protect, mitigating, or migrating wildlife. It'll also assist in the recovery of threatened and endangered species. It'll help manage, control, and prevent invasive species and diseases. And it will help to ensure that we have the staff capacity within our tribes to do all that we can to protect our wildlife. And one important thing is it does allow for funding for conservation law enforcement. So just looking at how tribal title is different than the states. For tribes, it's a non-competitive application process. The guidelines and criteria will be determined by the Secretary of Interior acting through the Bureau of Indian Affairs in consultation with Indian tribes. There are no matching funds required. Public access is not required. And administration costs will not be more than 3% of, sorry, I'm multitasking here. Some people are entering. Administrative costs will not more than 3% shall be used for secretary to administrate the tribal title. And there's also, it does not impact treaty or tribal sovereignty.
Is slow.
Hey, quiet.
Can you mute yourself? Thank you. Whoops, going the wrong way. So just some important takeaways for recovering. It's new funding, $97.5 million for tribal fish and wildlife programs. 15% of the total funds will need to be used for threatened, endangered, or candidate species under endangered species law, are under tribal law. And that does not mean 15% of every tribe's funding request will have to be for this purpose, but the 15% of the total funds. You know, the goal is to fund as many tribes as possible. And of course, the distribution formula and process is not developed yet. So now I get to introduce our speakers, and I'm going to start with stopping my share here. Maybe. I'm going to start by introducing Shaun Grassel. He's an enrolled member of and a wildlife biologist for the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. He's worked for his tribe for over 20 years on conservation and management of wildlife species. Shaun's work includes monitoring population trends of game species and focal non-game species, conducting research and assisting in the development of policy. Shaun has a Bachelor of Science and Master's Science degree in Wildlife and Fisheries Sciences from South Dakota State University, and a doctoral degree in Natural Resources from the University of Idaho. Shaun was one of several tribal representatives that participated in the tribal fly-in to our nation's capital last year to advocate and request support for the Recovering America's Wildlife Act from members of Congress. Thank you, Shaun.
Thanks, Julie. Everybody hear me okay? Can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me?
Yes.
All right, thanks. I didn't know what Julie was going to say there for a second when she paused. I thought she was going to lib. I just wanted to start out by sharing with folks that, you know, the way this panel is arranged today is very similar to the panel that was held out in DC during the tribal fly-in last year. And so much of a lot of the things that we're going to talk about, we've shared with folks from, you know, from Congress and their staff and elsewhere when we were out in DC. One of the things that I wanted to mention first is when we talk about the tribal title, for those of you that aren't familiar, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act is basically kind of two parts. The first part, or one part, is for states and their fish and game agencies and addressing species of conservation concern. And the other part is for tribes. And so when we say tribal title of the act, that's what we're talking about, is that portion that's specific to tribes and tribal wildlife conservation. You know, if there's one thing that you could take away from my part here, is that this is landmark legislation for tribes. We have never been included in any kind of legislation that can have this much of an impact to our natural resources. There's been, you know, attempts in the past to maybe be included or get some, you know, Pittman-Robertson or Dingell-Johnson Act, and of course those efforts never went anywhere. But this process, or this proposed legislation, you know, it's a cooperative effort between states and tribes and industry, you know, NGOs. And so there's a broad coalition of folks who support this, and it's bipartisan. And so folks feel that there's a really good chance that this can be passed. And so I encourage folks to start thinking, you know, to follow this, to track it, to support it everywhere you can, but then also start thinking about how to implement this on, your reservation, your tribal lands, when it happens. But I think most folks think that there's a really good chance that it will. So one of the things that the Recovering America's Wildlife Act does is it recognizes that tribes are grossly underfunded for wildlife management. As Julie mentioned, the bill contains $97.5 million that would go to tribes to adequately fund our wildlife management programs. And Julie mentioned some of this already, but these funds can be used to implement programs to manage species of greatest conservation need, their habitats, threatened and endangered species. And these are things that we can identify as tribes. So we can have our own species list of animals that are of greatest conservation need, or a tribal, threatened and endangered species list. They don't have to match what the federal government has or what state governments have. We can use these for wildlife-related education and recreation projects. These funds could be used for law enforcement. We could use these funds to control invasive species, to hire staff, to train staff, to retain staff. And it was written purposely broad to ensure that the needs of wildlife conservation can be addressed. And so I want to give you guys two examples of, how this affects me and how it hits home to me. The first case study I'll talk to you guys about is my tribe's efforts to recover black-footed ferrets. We've been involved in ferret recovery for over a dozen years. They're a federally listed endangered species. We and several other tribes are partners with the federal government in this endeavor, and it has national significance, but it's not easy. We are continually challenged by things like habitat fragmentation, social intolerance, and disease issues. And a considerable amount of our time and human intervention on an annual basis is required to overcome these challenges. We spend weeks out in the field searching for ferrets. We spend weeks managing, diseases in the landscape, and we continually communicate with tribal producers and our tribal leadership on the progress of our project. And although this effort has national significance, we don't have reliable, adequate funding. And therefore, we have to continually look for funding, and we have to piecemeal the funding required from several sources to get our work done. So what this means is some years we can do a lot of work, some years we can't do a lot of work. We never know how much funding we're going to have from one year to the next. And so it makes long-term planning difficult, and it makes employee retention very difficult. And this is for one of the most endangered animals in North America, for which we are a partner with the federal government. And so we have those issues, even though we're a partner with the federal government to recover these species. And the second case study I want to mention is it's something that doesn't have the national significance that ferret recovery does, but it has cultural and economic significance. This is about our efforts to determine the cause of a decline in our local pronghorn population. Pronghorn have always been hunted by our people, and when populations decline of any game species, hunting opportunity is lost. We lose the opportunity of passing that tradition on to our next generation. And the tribe loses economic opportunity from sharing that hunting experience with visitors. And so for years, we searched for funding to help us understand what was happening with our pronghorn population. And while we did eventually find funding for our work, and we're currently conducting some research, we lost valuable time. And having a reliable source of funding, like the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, we would have been able to enable a faster response to investigate situations like this, and what other tribes might experience across the country. So those are some of the things that I wanted to say. And like I said, the take-home message here, it's landmark legislation for us. And so we need to make sure that tribes are aware that this legislation exists. I think Jill is going to talk more about kind of the status of the legislation, where it's at right now. but keep your ears open and your eyes open and help spread the word, especially to leadership in your home communities. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thanks, Shaun. I overestimated my multitasking abilities and technology blending. So that's what was my pause. I was making sure I was recording. Our next speaker is Mike LaVoie. Mike began working as a biologist with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in 2007, and today serves as a natural resources manager. Mike was born and raised in Western New York and has resided in North Carolina since his graduation with a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Wake Forest University in 1999. He received his master's in biology from Western Carolina University in 2006 with a focus on fisheries and aquatic ecology. He also currently serves as a Southeastern Board of Directors and Vice President for the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. Mike, do you want to share or do you want me to bring your screen up?
Yeah, I can share it, Julie, I think.
Okay.
Give it a shot, maybe. Hey, look at that. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yep.
It's in. You need
Cool.
to, yeah, go. There you go.
Awesome. Well, thanks, everybody. It's really good to, oops, I messed it up already. There we go. Thanks, everybody. It's really good to see some familiar faces, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today and share some of Cherokee's perspectives and as well as some broader perspectives on recovering America's wildlife. I wanted to also mention too, I'd like to today kind of weave in some economic perspectives on how we're experiencing conservation here at Cherokee, and ask people to think about a bit what that may mean for their own homelands. I know talking money and conservation isn't always a comfortable thing for biologists, but I think as we continue to push the needle with this legislation and get it over the finish line in the time of COVID and economic downturn, we're going to continue to need to voice that this legislation is going to be a huge job creator and support tribal economies. So anyway, to start off and give you a little bit of background information about Cherokee. So today, Cherokee homelands are located in Western North Carolina and cover about 60,000 acres. But Aboriginal Cherokee homelands covered a huge swath of the southeastern United States, over 120,000 square miles. And this rich environment, expanding from the river bottomlands up to the highest mountains in the eastern United States, supports a tremendously rich environment and biodiversity that again was intricately tied to Cherokee identity and culture. The southeastern Appalachians harbor over 10,000 different species, and these were all really tied to a variety of Cherokee cultural values, everything from food and medicine, art and tools, as well as clan identity. We're really all intricately connected to animals and plants. So maintaining this rich biodiversity in the region and its connection to Cherokee culture is really a critical goal for our tribal conservation program, as well as a critical need for ecosystem services and economic development within the area. So for over a decade, with really limited funding, we've worked to develop a pretty robust fisheries and wildlife management program that covers a lot of different projects and programs. So I'd like to kind of get into a few of those projects and hopefully provide some insight as to how recovering America's wildlife could benefit other tribal conservation communities. So the Eastern Elk is a really important program for our department. Elk were reintroduced in the Smokies due to a historic extirpation from overharvesting. So they're now continuing to rebound, and they garner a lot of our staff time and capacity to manage. So they've really grown into an important economic resource for Cherokee. They've been found in a recent study conducted with Responsive Management to provide almost a $7 million local impact to businesses and the Cherokee community. So it's ecotourism is continuing to be big business for the tribe, and proper management is required to kind of keep that engine running. So that said, opportunities like Recovering America's Wildlife Act will hopefully help us bolster our staff capacity to continue to deal with nuisance management issues like elk getting in the gardens or protecting public safety, and also help us to support habitat restoration, which eventually we can hopefully grow this population so it can be both a food and possibly a big game economic resource for the tribe. Bats are another important group of animals that require our attention, and they're suffering huge populations decline, mainly due to a non-native disease, white nose syndrome. These trends are really concerning for ecosystems. Bats play a tremendous role in reducing pests, and it's been estimated that they create almost a $3.2 billion economic impact for the agricultural sector in this pest control service. So ultimately, we have 3 listed bat species at Cherokee, and they take up a lot of our efforts to manage and to ensure we're not impacting these animals, and also managing our forests sustainably. So our staff are highly involved, and takes a lot of tribal resources to go out and make sure even individual trees aren't harboring nesting bats or roosting bats, so we can protect these animals, but also ensure that economic development proceeds at a reasonable pace. Really, the lack of staff and capacity results in a significant negative impact to tribal members, as some of their projects are slowed down. People are often slowed down from even building a house with just cutting a few trees because of listed bat issues. So we continue to need additional resources to help alleviate tribal member burdens. So conserving and restoring aquatic ecosystems that ultimately produce clean water for the Cherokee community is really a critical focal area for us. The southeastern U.S. is home to 2/3 of the nation's fish species, 90% of freshwater mussels, and almost half of all crayfish globally. So each of these different faunal groups really faces a high degree of impairment. So we work to protect our waters through habitat management and restoration, research, and then actually active restoration strategies in terms of translocating fish and mussels to improve biodiversity on Cherokee waters. And many of these species also are considered species of greatest conservation need by our partnering North Carolina agencies. So they both meet tribal needs as well as our state partner needs. And protecting and conserving clean water has a huge economic impact for the tribe. Trout fishing and our pristine waters are a huge draw for tourists. We get upwards of 50,000 people coming in to fish at Cherokee a year, and this produces upwards of a $26 million impact, as well as creating hundreds of full and part-time jobs. So conservation is really translated to economic health for our tribal community. An interesting story of a fish that I'd like to tell about a little bit is about the sickle-fin red horse. And this is it's a large sucker found only in Western North Carolina. And it's really a great example of how tribes and partners can work effectively to counter the extinction crisis. So although this fish was known to Cherokee for centuries, it has a unique Cherokee name that translates to wearing a red feather, as you can see with the red caudal fin. It really wasn't even known officially to science until 1992. So this fish was really a reliable source of protein for the Cherokee community, and would undergo large spawning runs after often lean winters. But unfortunately, it's declined drastically throughout the century due to dams and different sources of water pollution. And it was to the point where this fish was eventually declared a candidate to eventually be listed under the Endangered Species Act. So considering this was a really culturally important species and an animal threatened by extinction, Cherokee began working with the federal, state, and industry partners to begin to understand the species and restore it to its historic range. So Cherokee and our partners with the Fish and Wildlife Service and North Carolina Wildlife Commission, as well as Tennessee Valley Authority, conducted years of research to better understand stocking strategies and restoration efforts. And most importantly, we've worked to expand this fish's range into Cherokee watersheds. Eventually, these efforts led to a more formal partnership with the signing of a candidate conservation agreement in 2016. So this collaborative approach of fisheries conservation was really critical in the decision not to list the species under the Endangered Species Act. So ultimately, really, this proactive partnership resulted in reduced costs to our local economic development and has led to more productive restoration measures that aren't solely driven by the often heavy hand of the Endangered Species Act. I think, in our opinion, there's many similar opportunities that likely exist like this for other tribes, but often tribes just simply don't have a single staff member focused on biological resources to even begin these conversations. So hopefully RAWA, or Recovering America's Wildlife Act, is that landmark legislation to start to build this capacity to bring people to the table and start those conversations needed for joint conservation efforts across jurisdictional boundaries. So in closing, these are, just a very small sample of all the extraordinary work tribes are doing on a daily basis with very little support financially. Cherokee's situation is a bit uncommon in that we have gaming revenue and fisheries enterprise monies to help contribute to our conservation needs, but most tribes don't have that opportunity. And if federal levels continue to remain inadequate or even decline due to competing interests, tribal wildlife conservation is also going to continue to suffer, and the costs of facing this crisis will continue to escalate in the long run. I think tribes are also in a really unique unique position to lead our nation's efforts to conserve wildlife, considering long histories of stewardship, unique ecological perspectives, and as well as close-knit ties to these plants and animals at a very local level. So I think this Recovering America's Wildlife Act can continue to help provide tribes a strong voice they need to tell new and engaging stories and better illustrate the broader societal and cultural values of conservation. So again, to kind of echo what Shaun said, this is a huge game changer for tribes and really a monumental opportunity for proactive and collaborative conservation. It's estimated, unfortunately, that over 1 million species may go extinct over our kids' lifetime. So that's really hits hard, I think, for those of us who have kids and want to see a better world. So I think, this is it's a moral issue, and it's time that we face this challenge head on and consider this act as really a critical investment into our future and not just an immediate cost. But thanks. That's all I got, Julie.
Okay, thank you. Stop sharing your screen. Thanks, Mike. Our next speaker is Gloria Tom, and Gloria is the director of the Navajo Nation Department of Fish and Wildlife and has served in this capacity since 1998. Gloria has previously worked for the Navajo Nation as a wildlife manager, wildlife biologist, and an environmental specialist over the past 35 years. In addition to the Navajo Nation, Gloria has worked for the San Carlos Apache Tribes Recreation and Wildlife Department and the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Wildlife Services. Gloria received her Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Arizona in 1985. She makes her home in the small community of St. Michael's, Arizona, which is just outside of the Navajo Nation's capital of Window Rock. Gloria, do you want to share your screen, or would you like me to?
I'll go ahead and share
Okay.
it. Thank you, Julie. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody is doing well. It's good to see a lot of you. It's been a while since we've been able to visit with each other and see each other, and want to say special hello to my good friend John Banks. I haven't seen you in years, so it's good to see you. Um, a lot of what I wanted to cover has pretty much already been covered by Shaun and Mike. Um, but I'm going to go through a few points that I wanted to make. Um, Julie did a really good job in covering the details of the act and how we came to be as RAWA. I think one of the major things that we need to take away from this is that, well, there's a couple of things. One is that this particular law, if approved, would be fixing somewhat a wrong for tribes in terms of the PRDJ issue. Um, right now, tribes are not authorized under congressional legislation to participate in Pittman Robertson Dingell Johnson federal aid and restoration acts. So $97.5 million obviously is probably not enough for all tribes to do what they want, but it is something a lot more than what we have right now. The second takeaway is that this is a partnership that began with the National Wildlife Federation and extended on over to the Association for Fish and Wildlife agencies. And then also the NGOs are a huge part of that. And this is the first time, at least in my career, to where I can recall sitting at the same table with the folks from NAFWS. We've always been at odds, tribes and states, in terms of funding for wildlife conservation, lobbying for dollars at the federal level. And this is really unique because we're all on the same page here, and we're all seeking the same goals in terms of recovering America's Wildlife Act. So that's a pretty big takeaway, and something that we really need to um, keep moving on. Back in the 116th Congress, RAWA made it and fell just short of the Senate. We made it through the House. We were successful in getting a hearing or participating in a hearing with the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife, which is a subcommittee of the Natural Resource Committee. And right at the tail end of the Congress is when we were trying to get it introduced into the Senate, but we didn't make it. So here we are again with a new Congress, and so we're basically starting all over from scratch. But it's important to note here that even though we're starting all over, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of educating and doing a lot of outreach with our congressional leadership to inform them of the significance of this legislation to tribes. So we're looking at about $97.5 million in conservation dollars that would go to tribes through the BIA. And I think it's, again, real critical that we have the tribal support for the legislation. And supporting RAWA, you basically have to look back at how conservation dollars can benefit your tribe. And I wanted to give you a little scenario on how it could actually help my tribe in terms of conservation dollars and wildlife management. Right now, my department is basically trying to be creative in securing funding. And by that, I mean, we have a multi-funding base right now where some portions come from the BIA, Some portions come from grants. Other portions come from revenues that we generate for hunting and fishing programs. And then, of course, a lot of what we do as a department is subsidized by the Navajo Nation from our Navajo Nation general funds. And the revenues that we generate off of hunting and fishing programs and other types of outdoor recreation programs is probably less than 25% of our total budget. And so our department is comprised of about 50 full-time employees. And we range from the technical staff, the biologists, the zoologists, the botanists, the wildlife technicians. We have wildlife law enforcement personnel, our game wardens, our fisheries biologists, our fish technicians. So we have a wide range of personnel that work for the department. And looking at our total funding that we have for the entire department, with the responsibility of managing fish and wildlife on 18 million acres of land, our funding spreads out about maybe 20 cents per acre, which is really sad. If you look at the state of West Virginia, which is somewhat comparable in size to the Navajo Nation, their funding, at least a few years ago, was somewhere close to $3 an acre. And then several years back, we did a funding comparison with the U.S. Forest Service, and they were somewhere around $5 an acre. But that's pretty common. I mean, that's pretty common across the nation with tribes. I think we all can attest to the fact that, we do have to be really creative with our funding and how we secure funding to implement our projects. But even if we're not fully funded to do what we want to do, tribes are still leading the way in accomplishments in conservation and wildlife management. And I think if you look at the tribes across the board, across the country, you see tremendous amount of conservation work out there, and the successes that we're all achieving in seeing wildlife management and fisheries management being implemented on tribal lands. So we as tribes we're used to the low funding. We're used to the being underfunded, and we're creative in terms of finding out or finding ways to get things done. With RAWA, we're approaching it as it can only add to these successes, especially in this pandemic era. The last Congress, at the tail end, we were trying to get it approved on some economic stimulus initiatives. We weren't successful in getting it added, but it is something that can really, really help tribes and states in terms of recovering from this pandemic. RAWA can replenish local communities and local businesses. It has the potential to create a lot of jobs and open a lot of outdoor recreation opportunities on tribal lands. It has the potential to expand hunting and fishing opportunities, expand our outdoor recreation facilities and improve those. And basically, it's just bringing people and money back to our lands. A lot of our tribal nations right now are under lockdown because of the pandemic. And there's a big question mark right now on how are we going to restart our economies? How are we going to bring our people, bring the people back, our tourism dollars, our dollars to the businesses that operate off of tourists? How are we gonna bring all that back? And RAWA has the potential for really helping with that. And one huge component of RAWA is the youth component, you know, training young people, getting them interested in natural resources and wildlife management, and putting them in as interns or summer employment, doing specific training on conservation, teaching them about land stewardship and wildlife conservation, including habitats and ecological restoration. Um, because we, you know, all of us here, eventually someday we're going to retire, and we want to be able to hand the football off to someone who's going to continue to make good progress. Um, so those are some of the things that we've been looking at from the Navajo Nation's perspective. And what can you do as tribes? I'm really happy to see all of you participate in this webinar, because we really need to get this tribal component. Um, we need to really lobby to support it. We have a tribal coalition in place. It's just a small group of us that are really doing a lot of work to get RAWA uh, uh, noticed and eventually approved in Congress. Um, we want to see the tribal support letters. We want to see the tribal council resolutions of support. It's really important for Congress to hear from tribes, to hear, you know, how are these individual tribes going to benefit from this legislation. Um, Another key component of it is the partnerships that are possible with our state counterparts. Um, you know, we have a great working relationship right now with Arizona Game and Fish here in Arizona, and their commission um, last year made monumental history by offering a resolution of support for tribal inclusion into RAWA, and that was huge. So we really have a lot of work as tribes to really get the word out, um, educate our congressional leadership on RAWA and how it can benefit us and our economies, our job markets, um, and that's what we need tribal participation in. I mentioned we have a tribal coalition. We need to get that going again, but we need a lot more voices from all over the country. And right now we're small and few. We've handled a few major events in our nation's capital, but we still have a lot more work to do, and we really need to put our our congressional, our tribal leaders up front and to get them to support RAWA. So that's really the gist of my presentation, and I can't stress enough the need for tribes to really step up and support RAWA. Julie, I think that's pretty much my presentation, and I don't know if we have time for questions, but
Yeah, I think we're gonna have Jill kind of wrap us up, and then we'll have time for people to ask questions of the panelists. So thank you, Gloria. It's great hearing from you. So our last speaker is Jill Feldhusen. I hope I said your last name right. I realize I just call you Jill from NWF most of the time. She works for our partners and our friends in National Wildlife Federation on their federal wildlife policy program, and she's worked on the campaign to pass the Recovering America's Wildlife Act for the 3 years she's been at NWF.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. And I will definitely always respond to Jill from NWF. Yeah, and I just want to say thank you for inviting me, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. Working with you and everyone else on the Tribal Coalition has very quickly become my favorite part about working on this campaign at large. It's just been so successful, and just even hearing Gloria to speak and everyone else's presentations, it's very re-energizing. So thank you. And I'll keep my remarks brief. And I just want to reiterate sort of what Gloria said, and we just have a huge opportunity in this next Congress to really get this bill across the finish line. We got it further than it's ever been in the 116th Congress with a really great bipartisan vote in the House Natural Resources Committee, 185 bipartisan co-sponsors. It passed on the House floor as part of the infrastructure package. And so just like a ton of huge monumental achievements. And I think we're just in a really good spot right now to keep building on those. So I'll just start with an overview of the House, since that's where the most action is right now. Our bill champions, Representative Dingell, a Democrat from Michigan, and Representative Fortenberry, a Republican from Nebraska, are our leads on this bill and have been since it was started to be introduced 2 Congresses ago. And they're both personally very passionate about this, and they are great champions for us. So we are just putting the bill through Legislative Council right now, just finalizing the language, and we are really hoping, knock on wood, that it is ready to go maybe early next week. And as part of introduction, we're probably going to try to get a few key Democrats and Republicans to join them as an original co-sponsors. And we do that to try to build our, I guess, army of champions on the Hill who will help us, move this bill through the process when key moments come. And then once it's reintroduced, we're going to just work with Chairman Grijalva and the House Natural Resources Committee to hopefully do another quick markup. We're hoping to get another bipartisan vote out of the House Natural Resources Committee, so we'll be well set up to be included in packages that might be moving throughout the Congress. And I'll just add that, like last Congress, we got 185 bipartisan co-sponsors, and I think the feeling of bipartisanship is maybe not as strong right now, but on the Hill after the events of the past couple of weeks. But on a call with Dingell and Fortenberry's staff, they see this bill as a unifying piece of legislation. I think a lot of members, no matter where they sit on the aisle, believe in preserving our nation's wildlife and protecting our natural resources, and see this bill as an opportunity to bring people together and really move something bipartisan that's also monumental. So that's sort of our House outlook right now. And like Gloria also said, we have just honestly struggled more in the Senate. We have had a tough time finding a Senate Republican that's excited and willing to take this up. We do have a few Senate Democrats that are interested in leading the charge now, and that's exciting, especially with the power in the Senate flipping a bit. But we are still pursuing a Republican co-lead, because the bill will just have an easier path forward in the Senate if we are able to do that. And we want to keep to the bipartisan spirit of the bill that we built in the House in the Senate as well. So that's going to be a big challenge, but I think third time's the charm. This is the 3rd Congress that's been introduced, and hopefully this year we will find that Senate lead. And then another thing I just want to flag that's changed in the Senate with Democrats taking control is leadership in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee that the bill will be heard in. Senator Capito, a Republican from West Virginia, is the new ranking member of the committee. And she has a great history of working in a bipartisan way to pass important conservation initiatives, and has expressed interest in this legislation. Senator Carper has also expressed interest and is generally supportive. So I think there's just a lot more opportunity just even getting it through the Senate committee in this next round. So we remain hopeful. And so that's just a high-level overview of what's going on in the House and the Senate. And I just want to couch everything I just said in the opportunities that we might have within this Congress and this new administration to get this legislation included in some of the rumored packages that might come together. Some of those being, but not limited to, an economic stimulus package, an infrastructure package. Budget reconciliation is something that Senate Democrats seem really interested in pursuing. And so I think there's just a lot of different ways that we can try to get this across the finish line. And I don't want to say that we are trying to be opportunistic, but I think that we are trying to have a really robust bills in the House and Senate. So when opportunities do arise for us to get this bill included in something, we're ready to go, and we can make a really strong case to leadership that these bills or this bill will put people back to work. It'll invest in our nation's wildlife, and it'll do all of the really important things that everyone's been talking about today. And I think that we are in a good place to make that case. And I will just also add quickly that the Tribal Coalition just plugged in the last Congress and just made such a huge difference in building our co-sponsor count. There were some Republicans in the House that we had been pursuing relentlessly, and there was a tribal fly-in, and they had a meeting with a member, and the next day she was on the bill, and it was such a joyful moment. And so the impact was huge in the last Congress, and it will obviously continue to be. And so just really excited to work with you all, and hopefully this is the year. So I'll stop there and give it back to you, Julie.
Thanks, Jill. I think maybe just to add on to that a little bit, just to kind of highlight what some of the key things and for the Tribal Coalition were last year in 2020, 2019, 2020. We did a tribal fly-in and press conference with the National Wildlife Federation. I think you heard Shaun mention that. We also had have a spot on the NAFWS website dedicated to recovering and serving as a clearinghouse for tribal letters of support, which we had 49 of those representing 80 tribes in 19 states. So I think that was a really good start. We also have resolutions of support from the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, USET, ATNI, and NCAI. So I think as we move forward, those are kind of some things that we can use as a benchmark and build on. And also, if any of you are interested in joining the Tribal Coalition, I would suggest you can email. And that's the end of our speakers. If anybody has questions, I think this would be a great time. We have some time for questions. You can either use the raise your hand reaction thing, or you can chat, whatever, and we can have some discussion on that. I hate awkward pauses, just FYI. Does anybody have anything, any questions?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Brenda?
Yes, Brenda Ball with Auction Indian Community. I'm curious because I'm not familiar with this funding, and for a small tribe like Auction who maybe wants to get started with a program, but actually needs to, get things like ordinances in place that address wildlife, that address protected species, things like that. Would this funding be able to help with that?
Anybody want to take, I mean, I can answer them, but I don't want to be the only one talking, so.
I'll just say, yeah, it should. There's language in there, to develop plans and programs and hire staff. And so I guess my opinion is I don't see why it wouldn't.
Thank you.
Somebody correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think that's a great point. And I think that it kind of also speaks to just the diversity within tribal fish and wildlife programs. We have, I mean, you listen to Gloria talk about managing on 18 million acres, and then we have other tribes that are just kind of starting to develop those programs and need the staffing and exactly what you're talking about, the codes and the ordinances and all of that. So I would agree with Shaun's.
Julie, this is Doug from Little Traverse in Michigan. How are you doing today?
Good. Hi, Doug. Good to see you.
So just two questions here. One is we're on record with a resolution through our tribe. We have one through Cora. I think there's one through MAST also. Should those be updated, or the ones that we've had from previous last year or possibly even the year before? Are those sufficient, or do we need to update those? And then my second question is, has there been any real discussions intertribally about the best funding formula for those dollars? Is there anything in the current bills right now, or is that anticipated that there'll be some sort of group work after that on how that funding is distributed through tribes? Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess to your first question, I would say, updating resolution is probably going to be important. We have some talks with the tribal coalition about, sending letters and getting tribal support back on it and renewing letters. So we'll be sending out some information on that. Of course, the question about how is the funding going to be distributed, that always comes up. So it's a great question. As far as how, I mean, we've had some really, I would say, very basic initial talks about it, but I think the overall consensus is that we really need to focus on getting the funding. And I think it's also positive for us with the Secretary of Interior, is who we'll be working with to establish that. And we have someone on there who has a very great understanding of how Indian country works. But I guess in the talks I've been in, it's kind of been the understanding that we should really focus on getting the funding secured, and then that we really want to make sure that it has an impact in Indian country, and that it is, tribes that have a need for it, that they do get to see some level of funding. What that level of funding is I don't know. That'll come through the consultation. I see Caleb has his hand up.
Hi, I'm with EBCI, with Mike there, who gave a talk, and I guess Doug had one of my questions, so that was good. Whether we could all be on the same page as far as how to organize. But another one I have is some of this around like our land areas. So a lot of that was brought up, how much land, how many resources that tribes have. One thing that we've been considering is working off our boundary on Aboriginal homeland. So the EBCI is at less than 1% of what we think was about the extent of Cherokee land base. And we also want to conserve species that aren't necessarily in the realm of what the state might want to conserve. So is there room for us partnering with the state in additional conservation efforts off of land base, and can we include that land base? Is there any way, anybody know anything about that? Well,
I would answer part of that question, just kind of reiterating what Shaun had said. And what's kind of great about the recovering is it allows for tribes to determine what their species of greatest conservation need is. So it doesn't have to be, you don't have to go with something that's just totally from the federal government. As far as like working, I guess I'm not sure about that one. Does anyone have a good answer for that? Shaun.
I was got a copy of the bill here, and I was looking for that, and I can't find exactly what I was looking for, but it seems like using the funds in ceded territories, treaty reserved areas, it seems, and don't quote me, but it seems like that was allowable. But as far as, we haven't got to the point of, like a allocation formula. And so there hasn't been any decision on how those lands might be used in the allocation process.
Okay. And I guess the additional one, I saw someone, I don't want to steal but it was in the chat. Are there targets? So some of us know politicians, and you never know. And one of us, we're pretty numerous. We might know somebody we can do.
Yeah,
yeah.
Absolutely. I'll just jump in quickly with some of the Senate targets, and this is honestly just our initial list, but if other folks have ideas of their senators that they think might be interested or have a particularly good relationship with, that would also be really helpful to know. But right now we are really focused in on Senator Collins from Maine, and just for the Republicans, Senator Collins, Senator Portman from Ohio, Senator Rounds from South Dakota, and Senator Capito from West Virginia. We don't think she'll likely take the lead on the bill, but just as the ranking member of UPW, she's still someone we're really focused in on. We've also, and I'll just throw out, we've also talked about Senator Daines from Montana. I feel maybe a little more skeptical about that one. But yeah, that is our current highest priority targets. But I will say that's the Senate right now. But we also have co-sponsor targets in every state. And I've sort of gone through and figured out who would be the most helpful to have. And so if there are just House members in the House that you'd be willing to reach out to, that's also just very helpful.
Jill, I'd just like to expand on that. In Arizona, the last go around, some of the tribes in Arizona got together and kind of formed their own little sub coalition. And we sort of identified a strategy for reaching out to some of our congressional leadership as a tribal approach, not necessarily as one tribe. So we did that in Arizona, and I'm hopeful that we will do that again here, hopefully soon, with the Arizona tribes. And if that works for other tribes in other areas of the country where you can band together with other tribes who are looking at the same leadership, you know, it's best, I think, to do it that way. That way you have sort of a stronger voice going forward. That's just a suggestion that I had.
I think too, I was thinking about Caleb's question some more. I believe, and I know Shaun Seville's on here as well from NAFWS and Alliance. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the state is required to have a 25% match. So I'm not sure how that plays in, but it seems to me like it opens up a door for partnering with tribes.
I'll just add, Julie, if you don't mind. Shaun Seville says that's right in the chat box. But I found the part that I was looking for, Caleb. And keep in mind, this is last year's legislation. Legislation was introduced in the last Congress, so this may change a little bit, but it shouldn't change all that much, I guess, in this regard. But there's a section in there to manage a tribal species of greatest conservation need and the habitat of such species, the range of which may be shared with a foreign country, state, or other Indian tribe. I think that answers your question.
Thanks, Shaun. Any other questions? Well, if not, I guess I would just offer up, you know, my email and contact information if you want to follow up with any of the panelists or have questions specific, that I'd be happy to connect you, or if you are interested in joining the tribal coalition, that would be great. I see Jamie does have a question. Do we need to submit letters of support this time? Yes, we're working on that. Hopefully, we're kind of waiting for it to get introduced, is my understanding, and then we'll work. Is that correct, Jill? Okay, so Jamie, we'll definitely get that information out to you. But if anybody's interested in kind of joining the tribal coalition calls, we'd welcome that. You know, it's great to see so many people, and even if it's virtually, it's, you know, it's nice to see kind of people coming back and know that the passion is still there, and we really dealt with a lot in 2020. And I'm not saying Happy New Year till after February 1st. That's my new thing. But if anybody has anything to add, Shaun?
I was just going to say that there's the sign-on letter that Shaun Seville has been working on, and that there are a few tribes in the society are signers of that. But the more the merrier, especially from, you know, tribal nations and tribal governments. And so if there's a way to share that with folks who are interested,
Yeah,
that'd be great.
Shaun just put it in the chat. If you could put that for everyone, Shaun, that would be great. There it is. Yes. Thank you, Shaun Grassel. There's lots of Shauns today.
And is there a deadline for signing on to that letter?
Shaun is, yeah, go ahead.
I just got off mute here. I've got my 4-month-old on my lap here, so I was trying to stay on mute just in case he's stirring here. Hopefully he won't start screeching. But at least through the end of the week, probably more like beginning of next week, we're just trying to sequence this to wait for the bill text, get the final bill text back, and then wrap up the letter and get that up on the Hill. So at least through the end of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And like I said, it's great to see you. And I hope this year we get to see each other in person at some point. And I also hope that we get to figure out how to spend $97.5 million on tribal fish and wildlife. So take care and stay safe. And again, reach out if you have any